You probably recognise this music. Even if you've never seen the film, the score for Alfred Hitchcock's groundbreaking horror movie Psycho is one of the most iconic pieces of music from the 20th century. Why is that? Well, partly because it's a very memorable piece of music, but it's largely thanks to the enduring popularity of what was, at the time, an extremely bold film. Inspired by the bizarre murders and home decorating choices of Ed Gein, who famously made furniture out of corpses, Hitchcock's film, adapted from a fictionalized version of Gein's life by Robert Bloch, had a killer gambit. Its protagonist, Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, the most famous actor in the cast, isn't really the protagonist. 47 minutes into the film, she is murdered in the shower. Now, you already know this, but when Psycho first came out, it was massively shocking. You didn't just kill off your biggest star almost halfway through the movie, especially in such an overtly brutal and violent way, but this risk paid off massively. Psycho was a hit with audiences, so much so that the critics who had initially panned it were forced to reassess the film, which led to the movie's biggest impact in the canon of horror cinema. There was a lot of taboo subject matter in this film, and the Hollywood Production Code, which had been enforcing puritanical censorship rules on all Hollywood movies since 1934, was beginning to break down due to the rise of foreign film imports and the risk TV presented to the American film industry. Consequently, Psycho contains an unmarried couple in bed, our protagonist Marion in a bra, cross-dressing, and a flushing toilet, all of which were extremely rare at the time. Despite the explicit nature of the film, it was released with only very minor cuts and became a sensation, ushering in a new era of horror where the heroes could die at any moment, the villains could come from unexpected places, and people could use the bathroom. Seriously though, the twists and turns that Psycho takes throughout its runtime were revolutionary, and the film's success, along with the waning power of the Hollywood Production Code, resulted in an explosion of horror that didn't shy away from violence, sex, or contemporary society. Far from the sanitized depictions of American life in the 50s or the Victorian Gothic dramas of the old Universal pictures, Psycho ushered in a series of often low-budget but unashamedly dark horror movies. Among the best and the most successful of this breed of new horror were Tobe Hooper's oppressively atmospheric The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left, which contains a lot of clinically brutal rape and murder scenes, and perhaps most important of all, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which invented the zombie as we know them today. Not only that, but Night of the Living Dead powerfully reflected a growing mistrust of the government in the US at the time, most notably in the film's climax, in which, spoiler alert, the film's protagonist Ben survives the night without being eaten alive by reanimated corpses, only to be shot by the police. This is made a lot more powerful by the fact that Ben is black, although Romero insists that Dwayne Jones simply gave the best audition, but regardless of the intent behind it, casting a black man as the lead in a film from the 60s was extremely rare, and in the same year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, the gun-toting posse who kill Ben don't think twice about their actions and casually toss him onto the fire with the zombies. The horror movies of the 60s and 70s were unprecedented in their political boldness and the content that they were willing and finally able to show. Now, gore for the sake of gore is, well, not very interesting really, and as with any decades, the 60s and 70s had their fair share of exploitation trash. Blood Feast by H.G. Lewis is a good example. It's influential for its depictions of gore, but is severely lacking narratively and even technically. The film's director copped to this, saying, "I've often referred to Blood Feast as a Walt Whitman poem. It's no good, but it was the first of its type." Among the nonsense, there are an unusually high number of legitimate classics though, be they in the form of the plausible rip from the newspaper headlines fare of the likes of I Spit on Your Grave, which took The Last House on the Left and pretty much just made it even more violent and remains controversial to this day, with people arguing that it's a feminist film or just a hateful pile of trash. Or Steven Spielberg's Jaws, which used Hitchcockian suspense to compensate for a faulty mechanical shark and became the first modern blockbuster. The more outlandish The Hills Have Eyes from Wes Craven, or the ambiguously supernatural Martin from George Romero, in which the vampire is not a slick seducer like Count Dracula, or even a gross monster like Count Orlok from Nosferatu, but an awkward teenage boy whose clumsy sexual advances end in a mess that is really uncomfortable to watch. But if there is one theme that defined this period of horror cinema, it would be the outright supernatural. Repressed powers, malevolent demons, or even Satan himself all took to the silver screen in some of the most critically and financially successful horror films ever made. Beginning with Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, which slowly builds a sense of creeping dread and paranoia as Mia Farrow's Rosemary becomes increasingly suspicious of her neighbours' actions and starts to believe that they are trying to steal her unborn child. This is one of the most powerfully disturbing films ever made, not because it contains a lot of gore or jump scares. In fact, most of the film is extremely subtle, but the relentless sense of a trap being slowly closed on you is seriously effective. In a more bombastic vein, Richard Donner's The Omen follows an American ambassador who becomes convinced that his child is the Antichrist. The Omen features a lot of frankly silly death scenes, but the extremely melodramatic music and the film's less show-offy moments are genuinely frightening. We begin to see in these films a sense of uncertainty as to whether our heroes will come out on top or will even survive at all, something that was previously missing in even the best horror cinema until this point. But the quintessential supernatural horror movie, not only from the 70s but probably of all time, has to be William Friedkin's The Exorcist. Until recently the highest grossing horror movie ever made, and the first horror film to be nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, The Exorcist follows a mother and daughter living in Georgetown in Washington, D.C. The young girl, Reagan, begins behaving strangely after playing with a Ouija board. From here, things slowly escalate, with Reagan's behaviour becoming more and more aggressive and erratic, but when her mother takes her to the hospital, medical tests reveal nothing wrong with her. There is definitely something wrong though, and Reagan's mother enlists the help of two priests who attempt to perform an exorcism on the young girl, which proves to be more difficult than they had bargained for. The Exorcist is a great horror film. It has rich characters, a great script, an expert direction, and most importantly is really scary. Flitting between the subtle creepiness of Rosemary's Baby and the over-the-top terror of The Omen, The Exorcist somehow managed to be unrelentingly visceral and often quiet and contemplative, blending together in a perfect example of how horror can be both entertaining, heartfelt, and extremely unsettling all at once. This roughly 2-decade stretch of time contains some of the greatest horror films ever made. Films that push the boundaries of what was acceptable to show in a movie. They are surprising, often brutal, but just as often they are insightful and intelligent. Many people view them as the best films in the canon of horror cinema, and we're going to revisit some of them in a lot more detail at some point. But something else was lurking on the horizon in the late 70s. One film would once again change the landscape of the genre for years to come. It starred Psycho star Janet Leigh's daughter, and on an extremely low budget, armed with a few suburban streets and a painted Captain Kirk mask, John Carpenter would create one of the most enduring horror classics of all time, a film whose success would kickstart a new wave of imitators. I'm of course talking about Halloween, the progenitor of the slasher film.